Hello and welcome to the 805th meeting of the Economic Club of New York. I'm Barbara Van Allen, President and CEO of the club, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I hope everyone enjoyed their Memorial Day weekend. Before we begin, I want to extend a warm welcome to students joining us today from the Cooney Graduate Center and Rutgers University, as well as members of the 2025 class of ECNY Fellows, a select group of diverse, rising next-gen business thought leaders. The Economic Club of New York is proud to stand as the nation's leading nonpartisan forum for discussions on economic, social, and political matters. We've done this for more than a century, and we're pleased to carry a tradition of excellence on and up to including today, where we are lucky enough to have as our guest Raj Gupta. Raj was born in a small village in India and came to the United States in 1968 at the age of 22 with $8 to pursue graduate studies at Cornell University, where he earned his master's degree in operations research and computer science. He later earned an MBA in finance from Drexel University after completing a B.Tech in mechanical engineering from IIT Bombay. Raj spent 39 years at Rohm and Haas, a global Fortune 500 specialty materials company, retiring as chairman and CEO in 2009. He served as a director of 15 different public companies, including Hewlett-Packard, DuPont, Aptiv, Airgas, Tyco, and Avantor, where he also served as board chair for 12 years. He has served on the boards of 6 private companies, including the Vanguard Group and IRI. Through the Ujala Foundation, founded with his wife Kamla, he has supported education and healthcare initiatives in both India and the United States. The foundation has contributed to an endowed professorship at Johns Hopkins, initial funding for the Drexel University Gupta Governance Institute, fellowships at Drexel and Cornell, and support for Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, AIF, and institutions such as the Philadelphia Zoo, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which I love, by the way, and the Franklin Institute. The Johns Hopkins Gupta-Klinsky India Institute is the foundation's largest commitment to date. Today's program will be a fireside chat. We're honored to have club trustee Erika James as our moderator. Erika is the dean of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. In addition, we'll be using the chat box for this conversation, so you can enter questions directly into the chat box for consideration, time permitting. As a reminder, this discussion is on the record, and we will end promptly at 12:45. Now, without further ado, I'm happy to pass this time over to you, Erika.
Thank you, Barbara. And Raj, thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Erika.
It's a delight to see you and to be in conversation. And I'm eager to dive right in. I will just have a note for the audience that I'm happy to welcome questions throughout. So as we start our conversation, if there are things that interest you and you want to know more about them, please feel free to add to the chat, and I will keep an eye on those and ask them periodically throughout our time together. So Raj, I want to pick up where Barbara left off with respect to your journey, professional and personal. So you immigrated to the United States from India. You have had an incredible corporate career and career as a director. I'm wondering if you can just share with the audience, what about your early experiences, either in India or your formative years in college and graduate school? What prompted the journey that you find yourself on with respect to the career choices that you've made?
Great question. So first of all, I was born in 1945, and my father was a civil engineer. So we moved around every couple of years in different cities. And so by the time, my father wanted one of his sons, older son, me, to be a mechanical engineer, and the younger son to be in the government. So I followed, and he didn't want me to be a civil engineer, but a mechanical engineer, because that was the big thing in those days. I was fortunate enough to be accepted at IIT Bombay, which is one of the premier institutions for engineering in India. And what was one of the greatest learnings for me 5 years at IIT, actually two of them. One was I came from what in India was considered somewhat of a backward state. So, moving into more elitist groups of people who thought they were the elites coming to Bombay, that was one. And the second one was, it was a selection that was purely based on merit. And you think, you're a good student, but when you come and compete with 300 students who are smarter than you, it kind of makes you humble. Mm. And I think the two things about that 5-year journey to me was the fact that adjusting to a different kind of a social environment and learning to compete and thrive in that environment. And I think those two things were probably the biggest learnings for me in terms of 5 years at IIT, other than becoming an engineer. But the fundamental values really go back to my parents, and that was hard work, education, humility were really important elements of what they taught us. And there's 6 of us born over 7 years. So that was something we grew up with, and that stayed with us. And we had a very interesting relationship between IIT Bombay and Cornell, because one of the professors got to know one of the earlier graduates, and he liked them so much that over a period of 10 years, he offered a fellowship for either doing master's or PhD in operations research or computer science to the top 3 students who graduated out of mechanical engineering. So that gave me a free ticket to come to United States in January of 1968. And only other thing I'll add to that is, I was 22 and my parents said, you're only going to US after you get married. So a week before I left from India, my parents found the wife for me and we are together for 57 years. So that was the other part of the journey. So we sort of grew together. But then, of course, when I was at IIT, at Cornell, somehow being an engineer and more pragmatic, the idea of operations research, which was very theoretical, after one semester, I said, this is not my calling. I need to move on from here. Mm. And so I left after master's degree. And then I said, I need to work for a couple of years before I go back to India. And I was very fortunate to get a job with IBM, Burroughs, Xerox, Kodak, and Scott Paper. And you might say, why did I choose Scott Paper? Very simple reasons. Only relative I had was my uncle was a professor at Villanova, and we were expecting our first child. And Scott sent a company plane to pick me up and drop me for an interview. So, that was a big deal, right? So that got me started at Scott Paper. At Scott Paper, I was there for 2.5 years. That's when I did my MBA in finance from Drexel. And my parents were still alive. They wanted me to come back to India. And Scott Paper had nothing in India. So I interviewed and I got a job at Rohm and Haas with operations in India. So that's how I started at Rohm and Haas. And it was an amazing 39 years. I had 13 jobs, 17 bosses. I worked on 3 continents, got amazing experience in functional areas, business areas, regional leadership. And I think it sort of taught me how to deal with different cultures, identify talent and opportunities for both business and individuals. And I think that was an amazing experience. And the role the 3 mentors played during my development were just phenomenal. And that included my 2 predecessors who were CEOs, and the CFO who recruited me, and the head of Europe, a Greek individual. So those 4 were always saw in me more than I saw in myself. And they kept giving me opportunities, special projects to do things that they thought I could do well. And I think that's really, those experiences built a huge amount of confidence in for myself. And I think that really eventually, I think, led to being my appointed as a CEO in fall of 1998. And I was the 5th CEO in the 100-year history of the company. So So it was an interesting journey to get to that place. And India, I only went there as a visitor. I never really moved to India.
You've given us so much fodder in that one response. I want to pick up on a couple of things that you said. One of which is, one thing that strikes me is a 39 career with one company.
Yeah.
And that is not necessarily reflective of what we see today. We see young people and newer adults and new professionals sort of changing jobs, changing companies pretty regularly. As you think about from a leadership and governance perspective, is that a healthy trend that we're seeing, or do you think that there are advantages for companies and individuals to stay with a single firm for a longer period of time?
That's a great question, Erika. I would say, this is just what I call trend which has developed over time. I think if I think about even my company, there were 3 generations who worked there. And in those days, people joined a company, built a career, moved around and advanced. And if they didn't see that was a good fit for them or got better opportunity, they left. But I think there were two-way things there. One was how you performed and your ambition, and the company's commitment to see you develop. I would say today, in most cases, it's individuals' responsibility to figure out what is it that interests them, what career they want to pursue, and because the loyalty is a two-way process. And so I think individuals feel like they have more opportunities to really explore their careers in different industries, different companies. And also, I would say some of the benefit systems have changed. For example, if you work a lifetime in a company, you had a retirement package, and now it's 401k that's mobile. So I think the degrees of freedom, opportunities, new industries that are emerging, there are a lot of things that are moving about that give individuals options to explore. And having said it, there are a few who stay with the same companies and move forward, but majority of them really have 3, 4, 5, 6 career changes during their working life. So I think it's just an evolution that's taking place.
Yeah. So thank you. I want to, I know that the young people who are listening today, the students are probably very interested in how to think about managing their career. So learning from someone like yourself is likely to be quite resonant with them. We have a question that came in that it also speaks to something that you said in your earlier remarks. And our audience member is asking, can you comment on the brain drain, particularly from the IITs that India has faced? And while the US has gained immensely from that kind of immigration, would you say that the Indian government is trying to or needs to retain talent from these prestigious institutions?
Great question. I would say, when I graduated in 1968, and probably for a period of 10, 20 years, 70 to 80% of the class at IITs migrated to the United States. And I think there were a couple of drivers for it. One was the renowned institutions in the United States, which offered higher education. And the second thing was the career opportunities that the United States offered as opposed to India, which, for a very long time was a very, I would say, controlled by few families, a very bureaucratic setup, and not necessarily a merit-based system. So there were not enough opportunities, and you did not feel, I always used to say, the 2 ways you could advance in India, you were born rich or you were super smart. And if you were just below that category, you really felt that a career for you, studying in the United States and building a career in the US, with a US company, was a better future. So a lot of us migrated after 1964, after Lyndon Johnson passed the bill. That's when really the migrants, just to give you a couple of statistics, I think Indian Americans, there were 100,000 in total in the mid 60s in the United States. And today it's 5.2 million. And so I would say there was a lot of movement of higher education, and majority of them, by the way, were scientists, engineers, and doctors. Very few in business, very few in media, very few in many other professions. Of course, that has changed a lot. But now, India offers enormous opportunities. It is one of the fastest growing economies. Entrepreneurship is here to stay. If you think about the number of startups, not only in IT, but healthcare and many other sectors, India is on the move. So people still like to come here and study, but majority of them go back to India. So the number of migrants who come from IITs to United States today, the majority of them really head back to India after a few years of experience and start a company there or work with organizations there. It has changed.
So I want to go back to you and your professional career. You spent, I think you said 39 years with Rohm and Haas, and you led the organization through a dramatic period of globalization and ultimately a very successful $20 billion acquisition by Dow. Tell us what you learned about yourself, about leadership, and about governance in those 39 years with Rohm and Haas.
I learned a lot of things, but see if I can just boil it down to 3 or 4 things. One, obviously, I'll talk about personally what I learned, but more about professionally what I learned. I would say one thing was to really keep an outside-in mindset. And what do I mean by that? It is really not looking at what the company was doing or the businesses was it in, but thinking more about how the world is changing outside and how it's going to impact our current businesses and what are the other opportunities we should be thinking about. So that is what I learned how to think about at a company level.
And just how do you get that perspective?
So I would say a couple of things. One, obviously, was just reading, attending conferences and meetings. And in fact, something I've promoted at every board I've been at over time, inviting people who are experts in their domain and come and chat, talk to you. So it was a combination of things, obviously the input from our customers as well, and just watching and seeing what was happening to some of our traditional businesses in an environment that was changing. So the outside in view, in fact, I would say it's even more critical today than it was when my career was moving, when things were moving at a slower pace. So that was something that I learned. The second thing I would say, both personally and professionally, I learned is you are there to do your job and meet expectations and do better, but also thinking about what can I contribute more, or what organization should be thinking about beyond to get better. And I think having the courage and opportunity to express those perspectives to people in a position of authority and power really was a great thing for me, because they were listening to ideas. They were not always great ideas or best ideas, but you have to step up and say not only what you're doing and how well you're doing, but important, how can you contribute more to the success of the organization? So I'll give you a couple of examples where I stepped up even when I was in a staff role. For example, when I moved to England in '79, and UK was going through a pretty difficult transition politically and economically. And we had most of our facilities in Europe were concentrated in the UK, but it was clear that the UK, being farther out from EU physically, and was not where we should be having center of all our manufacturing activities. So I came to my team, and I was in a planning role to say, we need to completely restructure our manufacturing network, move out of UK and really position ourselves in France and Germany, where the growth is going to be. And it was not an easy thing, because in those days, each country had its own plant, own leadership, own general manager, or own financial results. And I think that was an interesting opportunity for me to really demonstrate that we needed to do something different. Then, of course, one of my career moves was to head up Asia. And my then CEO essentially said, Raj, We are underrepresented in Asia. We have a lot of confidence in your ability. And over the next 5 years, you have to put Rohm and Haas on the map in Asia. So we went from 5% of our revenue and 5% of our profit to 30% of our revenue and profit in 5 years' time. And we built 14 facilities in Asia, in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Thailand, India, and China. So I think that was another one. The third one, final one, which I think was probably instrumental in my being promoted to the role I was, in a planning role, was to say we were a basically organically grown research-based company that globalized its product line. That was the formula of Rohm and Haas success for becoming a global specialty materials company. But what was clear that number of our products were getting commoditized, and number of businesses, we were too small to be a global player. So in a period of literally 6 months, from 98 to 99, we essentially divested half the company. And we spent $6 billion of cash to acquire 3 companies, and went from 10,000 to 23,000 employees, from 35 sites to 105 sites around the world, and a completely new CEO and a completely new management team. And from 0 debt to 4 billion in debt. That was a big, bold, and we'll talk about that, why bold strategy in an environment that we are living in today is so important. But how you manage the risk is even more important, and how you execute. So I would say, those 3 or 4 things that, and we went through a, crisis after we made those acquisitions, and the economic collapse happened, and the dot-com bust happened in 98, 99. And then we kind of had to re-navigate and re-pivot. And of course, but over the period from 98 to 2009, Rohm and Haas was the second best performer in S&P 500. And that includes every industry and every company, large or small. So we did something right.
You clearly did something right.
So,
yes.
so I think those are 3 or 4 examples, Erika, that come to mind about some of the turning points in my career and experiences, which I think perhaps got attention of the board and the management.
Thank you. So let's turn to governance matters now. So over the span of the past couple of decades, you have either reported to a board of directors or been a director on one of numerous boards. Give us your sense of how the board responsibilities have evolved over the past couple of decades, and where you think they are now with respect to their effectiveness.
Again, a very, very important question for 2 reasons. One is boards represent the shareholders and stakeholders. And for a very long time, I would say CEOs manage the boards, and boards were focused on oversight and compliance. I mean, that has been the role of the boards. But over time, I would say it has changed and evolved, and from oversight and compliance to a true partnership. And I'll come back and talk more about what's driving it. One, of course, is, if I think about a world which is uncertain and volatile and complex, that's an ongoing thing. But if I think about from the time I started my career, I literally think of one instance in each decade that was kind of big change. For example, in the 70s was oil price quadrupling from $2 to $8 and all the implications it has. In the 80s was falling of the USSR and the 87 financial crisis. In 90s was the Asian crisis and dot-com bust. In 2000 was 9/11 and basically the financial collapse again in the 2008, 2009. And then you would think, to me, 2009 to 2019 was a real calm period. Inflation was low, interest rates were low, there were no big wars being fought around the world, and capital was amply available. And that was when the markets were thriving, global economies were thriving. But here is what was going on underneath. China was rising big time. Innovation was accelerating. New technologies were having impact. Cyber was becoming important. Then we, of course, had natural disasters were more frequent and more violent. So there was a lot, and the wealth disparity around the world was increasing. So if you think about all
I would also add social media.
social media and the pandemic. So if we think about the amount of things that have been thrown at or have emerged in the last 5, 6, 7 years, maybe pandemic triggered it, but and now of course the geopolitics and many man-made challenges, not just natural challenges that everybody is facing. So in this kind of environment, really companies, and the other statistics basically say the CEO tenure has declined from 10 years to 8 years to 5 years. Activists are attacking more and more companies, large and small. The exit from Fortune 500 list of companies increasing every year. That really basically says that unless you as an organization is willing to change and deal with what's going on, there's no guarantee that you would be successful. That means your past success does not tell you about your future success. That's the environment you're living in. So here is what I feel that boards do two things that are most critical. One is the selection of the right leader. And hopefully they don't have to do it every year. But, and if by the way, if they make a wrong choice, be willing to make a move on that. That's one. The second one is the allocation of resources, capital. That is capital, the talent and capital. Because those are the two decisions that have long-term consequences. And the final thing is to make sure that the culture and the ethics in the company is correct all the time. I mean, I think those are the three things. Obviously, they still have to do oversight and compliance, but committees can do that. But this is really where so now here's the interesting thing that after I wrote that recent article, the directors and boards, I got what dozens CEOs writing back to me saying it's very relevant. But here is our challenge, that if as a CEO and C-suite, we are dealing what we have to deal with. That's the current environment. Our board is not in tune. And the reason they're not in tune is because they have never dealt with this space of change and magnitude of change. So this comes back to what you would really ask the question about how do we kind of make sure that we have the right leadership of the board, the relationship between the chair and or the board leader and the CEO is a very open one. And we have right skills on the board, and we can talk about what skills I think in the current context are important. But most important is the environment we create in the boardroom. That we are not just saying yay or nay or discussing and asking a few questions of this management to the CEO and saying go or no, don't go, but really get engaged and bring your input into the discussion, look at options, understand the risks. It's a very different level of engagement that's expected of the board in the current environment.
I'm curious if I could just interject. Yeah. How do you then ensure that boards don't cross that line into managerial execution types of activities as opposed to oversight and guidance?
A very good question. I would say, I think a couple of things. One is the board would now meet more than 4 times a year. There are a lot of virtual meetings and things like that on specific topics. Committees do the same. The bulk of the time of the board should be spent on what we call TSR, the talent, strategy, and risk. And less of the time, no more than 15 or 20 minutes of the time should be spent on compliance and oversight and last quarter results. And I think that basically, obviously, all those things need to be done, but they should be delegated to the committees. If we believe that the board really adds value on talent and capital allocation for the purpose of long-term value creation, that's where they should spend the time. That does not mean that they should be telling the management team or the CEO that that's what they should be doing. But really asking them two things. One is to come up with options rather than just one plan. I want to acquire this company, or I want to do this. Is to really look at, because everything has more than one option or opportunities, to look at more than one or two options and have a debate and get an outsiders come in and provide their perspective on it as well. And then you really have a debate about why one is better than other, why one is less risky than other, and what are the execution challenges that each one of them faces. And you make a decision based on that. And what it leads to is what I call a alignment. Alignment and understanding, so that if things don't turn out right, boards can't say, you never told us this. It is something that, I mean, this was my experience when the Rohm and Haas was sold, was board took 6 months once the family and the Haas family came and said they want to divest and diversify. We took 6 months to decide, is it the right time? Is it the right valuation? Is it the right currency? Because 2008 and 9 was a very challenging time. And do we have the right conditions in our contract? And had we not done those things, like many deals fell apart, ours would have fallen apart as well. So I think, you know, and the board and the family was informed that when we were going through this challenging times, when it looked like it may not go through, they were all aligned and knew exactly why we made the decision and how we made the decision, and we were all united. So there was united front on that, and that helped us eventually close the deal.
I'm curious if you have an opinion on executive versus non-executive board chairs.
Honestly, based on my experience, lead director, executive chair, non-executive chair, title doesn't really matter. And I've done all those 3 roles. I would say what matters is the clarity of the description of what is expected of the role of the board leader and what's the role of the CEO. And as long as that is clear, it doesn't matter what the title is.
Thank you. So you referenced this a minute ago. You described the current environment as being bonny, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible.
Yep.
It seems like that's an impossible context to expect organizations and leaders and boards to be able to navigate. So, but it obviously can't be impossible. So what are some of the specific skills that we should be looking for in our directors and or management leaders in an environment that you describe as brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible?
So let me first, Erika, talk about the board and board skills. Okay, and then I'll talk about maybe CEO. As I said, you know, I think the board leadership role becomes very critical. That you have a board leader who has respect of the peers in the boardroom and has full trust and connection with the CEO. Because, you know, they're not just a messenger from the board to the CEO and vice versa. They really have to have the courage and support and understanding that they're conveying the point of view which may be at odds with how the management is thinking at times. So that's one. Part of it requires, as I said, you know, few things in terms of board makeup, I would say, and we can talk about how to accelerate the board, what I call refreshment. Obviously, you need domain knowledge. You need a financial expert. I think CEOs, irrespective of the industry, bring a unique perspective because they deal with multi-part challenges. I would say, you know, CHROs, because the workforce and talent is becoming increasingly important. I think having people with people leadership skills having on the board is a good thing. And the last thing I would say is the demographics, because, you know, I think boards are reluctant to recruit younger people because they think it's a lifetime appointment. And if they have a 35-year-old on the board, he or she will stay for 30 years based on the current way of staffing the public boards. And I think it's so important to get demographic point of view because the generational thinking is very different. So those are some of the things I would say are important skills to have in the board as part of the refreshment process of the board itself. The leader, and of course, the skill sets. Amongst the CEOs, you know, I think that's a couple of things. One I would say is somebody who is a good listener. Because as I said, you know, there's so many things going on outside world, somebody who is externally focused, not just internally or based on history, what worked in the past is going to work in the future. Or somebody who is very, I wouldn't say autocratic, but more directive. So I think listening ability is extremely important and to get different perspectives from both inside and outside. The second thing I would say is communication skill. Because, you know, with changing environment, not everything goes according to plan. Have the ability to share the longer term vision, and when things don't go right, admit it and be willing to pivot. Because I think that's also a message for the management team. Is that, you know, if things are not going right, don't just hide them behind, but speak up and tell us what is it that we should be doing to fix it, rather than just kind of hide it under the cover for a while and then things get really bad, or you waste a lot of time and money. So I think willingness to listen, willingness to learn from mistakes, keeping an outside-in perspective, and really, I would say, building the trust and confidence of all stakeholders, not just the owners. I think those are some of the traits I think in CEOs is becoming important, and without sacrificing what your core strategy and purpose is. And while you deal with all the impossible things that you have to deal with every day, whether it's tariff or, you know, borders being closed or the supply chain and all of that.
What you're describing is really resonant with me. I've spent, you know, the vast majority of my professional life either as a leadership and organizational behavior professor or leading an institution. And things like empathy that you talk about, listening, communication skills, interpersonal skills, building trust and confidence, they're all sort of a new wave of thinking with respect to leadership. I'm wondering if you have found in your experiences with the boards that you've been a part of, any resistance to those kinds of what we would refer to as soft skills taking preeminence right now relative to some of the more traditional kinds of leadership skills that I think we've seen in previous decades.
Yes and no, because I think what I found is exec CEOs who have been in position for a long time and really have more knowledge, more confidence, everything that they've done has been successful. And in those cases, boards tend to defer a great deal to them. They will occasionally ask them a question. But if a new CEO is coming in, or somebody who is there for in a new assignment role, I think to me that has this whole thing about empathy, listening, delegating, identifying talents, and all of that has to be part of the assessment process of selection of the right CEO. Because just having a good track record of delivering results of a business is not, because I think there's a huge step change between running a business or a function versus being a CEO. And I think that has to be very much part of the assessment process as you select the new leader. Mm-hmm. And you know, you can certainly modify the behavior of the ones who have been successful for a long time, have been in the job a long time. Some of them are more amenable than others, but it's not an easy change.
So in keeping with this conversation on the skills that are necessary, if you think about either a management team or you think about a board, ideally you're trying to build a portfolio of skills, which therefore in my mind leads me to think about, diversity. What are some of the aspects of diversity that you have found to be so critical in organizational leadership and board leadership?
Well, as I mentioned, I think experiential diversity and skills they bring is obviously one of them. Your ability to represent who your clients are or who your owners are, I think that's an important aspect as well, because I think because in a boardroom or the management meetings, you get perspective from different folks, which I think is important, whether it's gender, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's color of skin or whatever religion, doesn't really matter. But I think at the end of the day, you're representing your customers and your employees and others. So I think that's important. But what is also very important in my view, and that's something I've tried to live by all the time, is don't compromise quality or qualifications to meet the diversity criteria. Because I think, once you do that, I think it is not good for the person and it's not good for the organization. And that's really where I think we have to say whatever we have is not compromising the quality of talent that we want to bring on, irrespective of the diversity. But diversity is an important input because that's what represents our employees and our shareholders and our customers.
Yeah, thank you. So we're coming down towards the end, and I want to leave on a note that's similar to what we started on, and that's talking about you personally. In addition to your tremendous track record of leadership and governance, you also have some personal interests around education and healthcare. Can you talk to us a little bit about where those interests came from and ways in which you try to contribute to those two sectors?
So I think the focus on those two areas came about from my own personal journey and experience as to what fundamentally makes a difference. One is obviously being healthy, and the second one is being educated. If you have those two, doesn't matter what your background, you at least have a chance to play in a fair field. And I think, and it's been my personal experience and my journey. So I think that's been always there. The second thing, Rohm and Haas was 40% owned by Haas Foundation, and now they of course diversified into different foundations, but they own 40% of the company, and they are, as you know, Erika, one of the most philanthropic families in the Philadelphia area. And I saw what was important for them and how they contributed back. And in fact, most of the wealth doesn't transcend into the successive generations. Majority of it is still going toward charitable causes. And that was another driver for me to see how that family behaved. Because in India, growing up in India, you always rely on all the social things and education and healthcare being responsibility of the government, not of people. So I think those are the two things that were always in the back of my mind. And when the company was sold in 2009, I was fortunate enough to have resources. And I said, I am going to focus on those two areas and also focus on both countries, my country of birth, as well as my company of adoption and citizenship. So what we have done over time, again, one other thing we did was to say, we're not going to create a big bureaucracy for this. I'm going to invest with people I believe trust and the organizations I believe. So we have stayed very focused in terms of where we have contributed over time. And as Barbara said, Hopkins has been a biggest beneficiary, partly because our daughter who is head of infectious diseases division at Johns Hopkins, has been working in India, and we have seen her work and colleagues on the ground. And that prompted us as probably the smoothest, fastest way to have impact on the ground in healthcare and education in India. So that's really was, and I was able to get my partner at New Mountain Capital, Steve Klinsky, to contribute to launch that. But along the way, you know, governance, as I said, has been near and dear. So that's what we have funded at Drexel, and the fellowships and scholarships in the name of my parents at Cornell and Drexel. And then, of course, it's what I call community organizations, a smaller scale, both in India. And so very focused on those two areas, and very much focused on two countries. And then I think, you know, it's as the time goes on, I think I have to get my two daughters more engaged and my wife more engaged in this process, but they're following on most of what we're doing.
Excellent. Thank you. Barbara, I see you're back.
Yes, wow. Thank you both so much. This was such an insightful conversation. And I think you've given us a lot to take back to kind of use as we go forward. And I think this emphasis on, as you said, talent, strategy, and risk is important for us all to remember. Speaking of focus. I want to just very quickly run through some of our upcoming events. This Thursday on the 29th, we will welcome back Glenn Hubbard and Larry Summers. That's a very popular video meeting for our members. We also have coming up June 5th, Dr. Adriana Gugler. She is a member of the Board of Governors at the Fed, and that will be a luncheon. On June 10th, we'll learn more about what's going on in the tariff world from the U.S. Trade Rep, Ambassador Jameson Greer. June the 26th, we have a author series webinar with former CIA intelligence officer Christina Hillsberg, and we are very actively working to add some additional events to the calendar, including working to confirm candidates for the New York City mayoral primary, which of course is fast approaching in June, among others. So we encourage you to mark your calendars and join us for these exceptional programs. And Raj and Erika, thank you so much for this really wonderful conversation. And I hope everybody has a great rest of the week. Thank you.